So for those of you who've been following the undercut grow out saga, this is how it's been going. It's been going. I don't know what you're gonna do with it. What are you gonna look at this? Like it is what it is, guys. It's hair. It's hair. They said it would grow back, and it is. Here we are. For the past couple of days, I've been staying way past my bedtime watching a 5-hour-long documentary on Asian Americans, aptly titled Asian Americans. It's a PBS documentary, and it is said to be the most ambitious project yet that documents the entirety of Asian American history in film form. When you think about it, Asian American history, when compared to like American history, or even more so Asian history, is a pretty short piece of time. It's barely over 100 years worth of history if you're starting from like late 19th century to like now. And so for a 5-hour-long documentary of this scale to be talking about what is in actuality like a blip on the historical radar is a pretty big deal. But the thing about 5-hour documentaries about like ethnic history is that I'm not really sure who's watching these documentaries besides people who are of that ethnic group or people who really like watching 5-hour documentaries. Luckily, I fit into both of those groups, so I really enjoy this experience. I even took notes. I took so many notes. So many. So this isn't really as much like a reaction video, because who makes reaction videos to 5-hour documentaries anyway? But I think that like if you're like me and you sat through this entire thing, you probably walked away not necessarily with like a bunch of spicy hot takes on like a 5-hour historical documentary, but you probably had some like thoughts, right? Or reflections, some of which probably felt deeply personal, especially if you're Asian American, because, you know, again, never before has there been this kind of concerted effort, this like 5-hour, what felt like an onslaught of just like seeing just history in a way that felt deeply personal and in this current day and age deeply, deeply relevant. So this isn't as much a reaction video as much as it is like, you know, overdue therapy for me. But if you're someone who walked away from this documentary feeling like you needed to have a conversation about this, here's your conversation. It is somewhat one-sided, but I hope that it will help you process your thoughts anyway. I think the timeliness of this documentary feels almost like unignorable. Obviously it's May, it's Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and so to have a 5-hour documentary on Asian American history feels very apropos, but we're also living through some extraordinary times. First off, you know, we can't talk about Asian history, Asian American history, without talking about, you know, things like Vincent Chin, things like exclusion, things like just virulent racism. I feel like maybe that's the story of every history of, you know, every person of color in this country, but those are still things that unfortunately feel relevant not just in our current like 21st century modern state, but like to right now, to like today, to like last week. You think about like Vincent Chin, whose story wasn't even mentioned till like the very last episode of this 5-part documentary, and your mind automatically goes to Ahmaud Arbery, who was shot just like last week, and you think to yourself, like you're watching this 5-hour documentary, which again just feels like, you know, it's history oftentimes is tragedy, and you see just 5 hours worth of generational tragedy, and you think to yourself, where's the redemption story in all of this? You think to yourself, aren't we supposed to see this like steady upward trend of like improvement? Aren't we supposed to look back at like what happened in the 19th century and be like, man, things were terrible then, thank goodness we didn't grow up during that time? Aren't we supposed to look at things like, you know, the Vietnam War, or like Japanese American internment, and look at those things, or like, you know, Chinese exclusion, and be like, man, I'm so glad those are things of the past. I'm glad that like I don't live in those times anymore. But the only impression I got when I watched this documentary was how little things change. The thing that like really drove that point home for me was like, you know, at the very beginning, obviously the documentary starts off in like, you know, late 19th century, where like, you know, basically the first like 30 minutes of the first part of the documentary was just like the searing imagery of like, you know, yellow peril, anti-Chinese propaganda, like pictures, caricatures of Chinese people with slanty eyes and Fu Manchu beards looking like this menace, ready to like, you know, infect and and take over and sully the purity of white America, those images are like seared into your brain as kind of like this relic of times past, right? Things that are like, you know, created by people who are way more racist than us, way less educated than us, way less progressive, way less evolved than people now. But then you fast forward to like the Vincent Chin case in the 1970s, just 100 years, 100 whole years after Chinese exclusion, after you know, all of that, and it's the exact same imagery. So like, you know, there's a shot of a bumper sticker protesting against, you know, Japanese imported cars that had like a little face on it, this little like chinky-eyed face that looks straight out of something from the 19th century. And when I saw that, I was like, 100 years of history that could be explained over a 5-hour documentary, and things have not changed. And then you look at Vincent Chin and you're like, that couldn't possibly happen now, and look what just happened last week. When I was watching this, it was just really hard to kind of like think about all the things that had happened and really see all like the tragedy and the pain and the oppression and the discrimination as something that is purely a relic of the past. Obviously, I'm talking about this in the light of the coronavirus epidemic, where like, you know, Chinese Americans, Asian Americans have been retargeted as being like, you know, the supposed cause or some sort of scapegoat for the kind of suffering, you know, health, economic, whatever, the kind of suffering that Americans everywhere are suffering from right now. And it doesn't feel real yet, if only because we haven't been outside and interacting with real humans for like 2 months now. But I'm not gonna lie, I mean, like, part of me is really kind of grateful that we have a good excuse to not have to go outside and interact with people, because I'm genuinely, as a person who owns a face that looks like this, who loves people who look like this, I'm genuinely afraid of like what my life will look like, what my interactions with people will look like now that we're living under a global paradigm that takes Chinese faces, Chinese people, and views them as something to be mistrusted, something to be feared, something that is symbolic of a virus that has ravaged the entire planet. How do you live under these sort of times? How do you watch a segment in the documentary that talks about Japanese internment and sit next to your immigrant parents and for them to be like, this is going to happen again? I don't know. I feel like one of the reasons why this documentary series is seen as so monumental was because there really isn't anything like it, right? You know, who in the world would spend the time and the money to make a 5-hour documentary series on a minority group that I think, I mean, maybe, I don't know, non-Asians, please give me the benefit of the doubt here, but I would be really surprised if like non-Asian people were really watching this, you know? It really feels like one of those things, even if you are Asian, right? And like, I feel like even if you're Asian, you're watching this because you're like, oh, this is a story about me, right? There's so few of those out there, but this is a story about me. And I think it really calls into question of like, obviously learning about history is important because that's the only way we know of the true magnitude of the bad things that we as humans have done to each other. And that's how we know that when we see it happening again, as it inevitably does, to say that like, hey, we've done this before, like, you know, here's how it ended, we don't need to go through this again, right? That's really the only kind of insurance you have. So yeah, history is super important. But I think at the same time, we're really selective about like how we view history, right? On the one hand, I don't know, I really hope that there are non-Asian Americans watching this documentary and seeing exactly the depth and the richness and the extent of which, you know, generations past of, you know, Asian Americans have fought for equality and for, you know, the right to be seen in their identity, their rightful identity as Americans here, for belonging, for legitimacy, and if only because those exact same discussions, conversations are happening again, and people are asking the same questions that have already been well answered and time tested through even just the purview of the Asian American experience alone. These are not discussions that we need to be having over and over and over again because we already know the answers to those questions. But at the same time, I think like if you're Asian American, right, and I think this is just a point of like just real honesty and vulnerability. I think if you're Asian American and you're watching this documentary and you're like, I am watching this because I want to see people who are like me, you might be watching this and if you're like me, right, I'm Taiwanese American, and I think like the word Taiwan was mentioned like one time during the entire 5 hours, and that was to like talk about Jerry Yang, who was the founder of Yahoo, like Taiwanese American, tech mogul. And so if it were me, right, as a Taiwanese American, I'm watching this 5 hour thing and I'm constantly, all I'm searching for are like, okay, when's my part coming up? When's my part coming up? You'd feel like there's no inherent value in me watching this documentary because it's not about my history. It's my history, but it doesn't actually talk about me, right? And that sounds like inherently incredibly selfish and self-centered, but let's not pretend that many of us do have those kind of tendencies. I think like with the advent of like, as much as we rag on like, or I rag on Asian Americans wanting to pin their entire activism, in terms of like how can we get Asians represented in the media, I think it really points to a certain desire of Asian Americans of wanting to be, we use the word seen, but it really is to be legitimized, for their existences to be, for them to know it's okay for people like us to exist in these spaces and do these certain things. And we're looking for a certain precision in that, right? We're really looking for someone who isn't just like a person of color. We're looking for someone who is Asian, but not only are we looking for someone who's Asian, we're looking for someone who's Asian that has the same kind of skin that we do, that speaks the same kind of language that we do, that eats the same kind of food, that whose mothers do the same kind of quirky things that our mothers do, things of that sort. And it just kind of gets more and more and more granular as we go along, to the point where it's kind of like, unless this documentary talks about Taiwanese Americans who immigrated during the early 1990s, whose parents were not from the KMT but were living in Taiwan since the 15th century, blah, 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 then this is not about me. I don't know if any of you identify with that kind of specificity, but maybe this makes it a little more relatable. As a person who like is second generation, right, whose parents are immigrants, I've always had a hard time fully identifying with the Chinese Americans or Asian Americans who immigrated decades before me, like Japanese Americans who've been here since the 1900s, or like, Chinese Americans who can trace their ancestry back to like, the 1800s, even, as far back as that, right? Like, I feel like maybe other Asian American millennials who grew up in immigrant families might have a similar story, right? Like, we know that like Asian American history has been defined by people who are not like us, and yet it's really hard for us to feel like to admit that that is actually our history, that our history actually has more to do with the Asian American students who protested at San Francisco State College to have ethnic studies, more so than anything else. I don't know. I mean, I think is a really humbling thing to kind of come to admittance to, because I think there's something about, immigrant kid identity that is always seeking home, that is always trying to figure out which group they belong to. And I think, as you're looking at like, this group of older Asian Americans who really, to be honest, paved the way for civil rights for people like us, who made it, literally possible for us to even have or our parents to have citizenship here, to naturalize, but we don't identify with them because they don't resemble us enough, right? And so this kind of like narrative of wanting to find a group of people that resemble us, and not really being able to settle for anything that doesn't, fit our aspirations, I think is an incredibly dangerous thing if you think about it, right? Because if we go back to the idea that like history, the knowledge of history, the recognition of history is so important for us to even move forward as a society, to even, or not even, right, to even like recognize the danger signs of when history is about to repeat itself, for us to like not to want to tune out any parts of history that don't have precisely to do with us, I feel is a very understandable thing from an emotional perspective, because again of that wanting to seek out things that resemble us, but it's an incredibly dangerous thing. I was watching this documentary with my parents, and I think it's always been really cool to like, to consume content relating to Asianness with my parents, because their perspective and my perspective is so different, and I'm really careful to like, really hear out what they have to say, because I think, I talked about this in my Tiger Tail video, but I think there's a certain danger in romanticizing. I think someone had called an article like writing fan fiction about your own parents' experience, which is something that I think will always stick with me, because I think that's like such a pointed way of putting it. But for basically to give them agency in how they're experiencing this. And I think one takeaway that my parents or my mom was talking about, that I'm not sure if I can ever fully empathize with because I'm not her, was this idea of like, as someone who has identified as like, you're by country, right? You're a Chinese person, you're a Taiwanese person, you're a Korean person, to all of a sudden then adapt yourself to Asian Americanness, what that then looks like. This idea of propending the hyphen American part of your identity is not something that automatically happens just because you step foot on American soil, right? Obviously, she's talking about how like, this idea of assimilation, which I think is kind of like, it gets into kind of hairy territory, right? The idea of like how much are Asian immigrants expected to assimilate into American culture. And I think, it's not as much about assimilation as it is about like, as she was saying, it's about how much of this country do you claim ownership of, right? How much do you find yourself accountable to this country? How much, and this is the key point here, like how much do you recognize your identity as an Asian American? Because so much of that Asian American identity has less to do with the fact that you are Asian, and it has more to do with the fact that you are now a part of a system, a history, a culture, a society that views you for your race, and that your identity is shaped around that, whether you like it or not. And there's no greater example of that kind of clashing of reality versus, just mere existence than the LA riots in 92, where I think in the documentary, one of the historians has said that Korean America started in 1992, right? Despite the fact that Korean Americans had been living in this country for, decades beyond that, but the idea of a Korean American identity started in 1992. Why? Because that event placed Korean Americans, their identity as like hyphenated Americans, as being, a part of this greater ecosystem, clearly into question because of this clashing with Black people, with Black Americans. And in that sense, you are no longer provided the privilege, you're no longer allotted the privilege of like just being, existing on this land, doing your own thing, letting nothing change, and just being part, like, spectator to the system and a bit of beneficiary in some ways. But you are forced to confront in a very painful way your place in this country. And sometimes that place is not a great place. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that really ends up being the crux of, regardless of generation, regardless of your history here, the idea of that hyphenated American part. When does that part really come into play for you? What does that actually look like? I think as we look at this documentary and we realize, and this is like my mom saying this, right? This idea that like, so much of our experiences has to do with imbalances of power. So much of that hyphenated Americanism has to do with the realization of your lack of agency in some places. And until you realize that kind of power imbalance, it's almost impossible to kind of identify with the American story, right? And I think this 5-hour documentary, I think some who are like looking to watch this to be kind of like, a cultural experience, might see this as being a really politicized piece of film because it just talks so much about oppression and racism and inequality. But the thing is that, like, I don't know, I think as I was thinking about this, I was thinking, as we're looking at the stories of like the Japanese Americans who are interned, or like, kids who were sent off to fight in Vietnam who are Asian American and called gooks, despite the fact that they were fighting for the Americans or being mistaken for the enemy, right? That sounds like a familiar narrative nowadays. There's, these are ordinary people. These are not necessarily radicalized, politicized figures, but these are ordinary Asian Americans who, regardless of their experience, part of their coming of age story has always included that idea of reckoning with their racial identity. This is something that comes about without exception. I think it comes in different degrees for different people. I think some people recognize it as, like it's just different for different people, right? But it feels somewhat universal. I think like every Asian kid comes to recognize their Asianness in one way or another, and that comes to become a really big part of who you are as a person, right? I don't think this is something that's done intentionally. It's not like, being Asian is not a personality type, but like I think being a person of color here in the United States, it's not as if like so much of your identity has to be your ethnicity. So much of it has to be your race, if only because the rest of the world will always view you through that lens primarily. And so you have to reconcile that part of yourself first before getting to know who you really are. One thing that struck me when I was watching this was the idea that I don't think that non-kids of color ever had to like go through that gauntlet of reconciling their racial identity before they could even learn who they were themselves, right? I don't even know what it means to like know who I am without having to reconcile the Asian part of me first. It almost feels like, what does it even feel like to know who you are without having to put race to it? Yeah, I mean, I don't know. One thing that my mom said that I thought was really, really profound was that like when we looked at all the instances of injustice towards Asian Americans, or even, just people in color in general in the US, what does justice look like? What does resolution look like? Or even what is the point of the struggle? What is the point of protest? I think the question I asked her was like, is it, what do we do in the face of injustice knowing that history is going to repeat itself and no change happens ever? Do we continue, is there a point to like being a part of like demanding change? And she had said, it's not as much about the end result of like having justice. Like the expectation cannot be, coming out of every struggle of your protest being like, we expect for things to change. But rather what protest does is that it speeds the process. It expedites how quickly people act and respond to injustice, whether or not justice is actually brought upon. Like, obviously for Vincent Chin, that didn't happen. And I think the same perhaps could be said about the Ahmaud Arbery case, in the sense that like, is justice going to happen with regards to that case, right? It should, but it not. If history is any indication of it, like there's not a lot of reason to hope. But at the very least, the mobilization of people around that case caused the cycle to move a little bit more quickly, right? So that we can move forward from this case and be ready to fight the next one, right? Because that's gonna happen. And so it's a tragic thing to think about, the idea that like the efforts of protest, the efforts of resistance and fighting for change is not necessarily going to amount to any end goal, but it does provide us like tools and experience to be prepared for when this thing eventually happens inevitably once more. Which feels all the more timely now, considering how history just seems to keep repeating itself in the most tragic of ways. So anyway, I didn't mean for this to be this serious. I seriously just like, I had notes and I did not look at them. You can probably tell. But anyway, I wanted to point to you guys to a couple of things regarding this very topic if you would like to continue the conversation, learn more, dialogue more. The first thing is actually going to be an infographic that a friend of my soon-to-be sister-in-law put together, a couple of her friends who are medical students, medical school students who put together just a really, really great piece of work that documents both Asian American history with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm going to link it down in the description below, but I encourage you also all to take a look, because right now Asian American history, it's May, obviously, but it feels knowledge of Asian American history and the history of oppression and racism against Asian Americans feels all the more relevant now, even though we're not seeing things like foment full out since we're all in our houses. But like I said before, combating oppression and racism and pain and strife and all of that all comes down to preparation. How well prepared are we to equip ourselves for this fight that is soon to come in the future? And the way we equip ourselves is with knowledge. And so I encourage you guys to take a look at that. and educate yourselves. The second thing is, if you are interested in learning more about Asian American perspective, as well as thought-provoking, quips from my parents with whom I have many of these conversations, I have a podcast. There's links to it down in the description below. There's also links to all of the full episodes on this very channel. It's on break right now because I need a break. So the first season is out, but it basically focuses on my experiences as a Chinese teacher, a Mandarin teacher, as an Asian American. And so if you're interested in that sort of thing, go ahead and check that out. Anyway, if you like what you saw, feel free to subscribe, send this video to a friend, invite them to a watch party of this documentary series. It's all on pbs.org for free for the time being. I know I sent this to my students to watch, and so consider this an assignment from me as well to watch this documentary this weekend. It's a really good watch anyway. So, all right, until next time, I'll see you then. Bye.